When you marry someone, you do not just marry them. You marry the family that made them, the mother who raised them, the father who sacrificed for them, the brothers and sisters who know them in the way that only people who grew up in the same house can know another person. You marry the Sunday dinners and the old photographs and the traditions that were established long before you arrived. You marry the history. And if you cannot honor that history, if you cannot look at the people who built the person you love and treat them with the basic respect that love demands, then you have not truly understood what you signed up for. Richard Calloway had never quite understood what he signed up for. He had understood the part about marrying Angela. He had understood the house and the children and the routines and the shared life. What he had never fully accepted was the package that came with Angela. Specifically, her mother Rose, her father Harold, and her younger brother Dion, all of whom had loved Angela without condition for her entire life, and who, in Richard's private accounting, were too present, too vocal, and too comfortable in a home he considered his own. He had been managing this feeling for 13 years with the specific strategy that men of his particular disposition tend to use, not open confrontation, but a steady drip of small dismissals. A comment here, an eye roll there. The kind of behavior that is always technically deniable but accumulates over years into something that everyone around it can feel and nobody can quite pin down. Until the afternoon, the Calloway family walked onto the Family Feud stage, and Richard Calloway, apparently under the impression that the cameras would not catch everything, made a comment about Angela's mother that Steve Harvey heard clearly. What happened in the next 14 minutes has been watched by over 60 million people and discussed in households across 3 continents. Not because it was dramatic, not because anyone shouted or cried or stormed off the stage, but because Steve Harvey said something so precise and so plainly true that it landed like a bell being struck. The sound carried, and it has not stopped carrying since. Angela Calloway was 48 years old and had been, for as long as anyone in her family could remember, the person everyone turned to when something needed holding together. She had grown up in a close-knit household in Memphis, the oldest of 3 children, raised by parents who had built their lives around the conviction that family was not a convenience but a commitment, something you showed up for regardless of circumstance, something you protected, something you did not walk away from when it became inconvenient. Her mother Rose was 71 and had been a seamstress for 40 years, altering wedding dresses and bridesmaid gowns and prom dresses in a small shop 2 streets from where she lived, building a reputation in her community through the simple and consistent practice of doing excellent work. Her father Harold was 73 and had driven a city bus for 31 years before retiring, a man so reliably kind to his passengers that 3 of them had attended his retirement party without being invited. They had simply shown up, because Harold was the kind of man people showed up for. Her brother Dion was 43 and worked as an HVAC technician. He was funny in the dry, understated way of people who grew up in houses where humor was the primary currency, and he had the specific loyalty of a younger brother who has watched his older sister be the responsible one his entire life and has never stopped wanting to protect her in return. These were Angela's people. They were warm, specific, real, the kind of family that fills a room not with noise, but with a quality of presence that you feel rather than hear. Angela loved them with the uncomplicated fullness of someone who has never had reason to question whether that love was earned. She had married Richard at 35, after a courtship that her mother Rose had privately found a little fast, but had kept that opinion to herself, because Angela was a grown woman and Rose had raised her children to make their own decisions. She had hoped the marriage would deepen over time into something that included her family rather than merely tolerating them. 13 years had told a different story. Richard Calloway was 52 years old and was, in most of the ways that the world measures such things, a successful man. He ran a mid-sized accounting firm that he had built over 20 years. He drove a well-maintained car. He belonged to a gym he attended 3 times a week. He was the kind of man who arrived on time and expected others to do the same and found it mildly offensive when they did not. He was also a man with a long-standing and carefully unexamined belief that his in-laws represented a category of obligation rather than a category of relationship. He had never said this directly. He was too smart for that. What he did instead was communicate it through 100 small channels, the slightly too long pause before agreeing to a Sunday dinner at Rose and Harold's, the way he checked his phone during Harold's stories, the comments made under his breath when Dion dropped by unannounced, the expressions that crossed his face and were gone before most people caught them. Most people, not Angela. Angela had been catching them for 13 years. She had addressed them calmly and directly more times than she could count. Richard would listen, acknowledge, apologize, and then, after an interval that varied but never quite reached permanence, resume. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had constructed a hierarchy in his household that placed his own comfort at the top, and had never been sufficiently challenged about the cost of that construction to the people around him. The Family Feud application had been Angela's idea, submitted with deliberate thought. She had wanted something that would put her family and Richard in the same room, on the same team, working toward the same goal. She had hoped that a day of shared excitement might accomplish what 13 years of patient conversation had not, a genuine softening. An actual warmth. Something real between her husband and the people she loved most. It had been a reasonable hope. It did not survive contact with Richard Calloway and a live microphone. The Calloway team was 5. Richard and Angela, her parents Rose and Harold, and her brother Dion. They flew to Los Angeles together on a Thursday morning, and the day before the taping was by most measures a good one. A bus tour, a long lunch, a walk along the waterfront where Harold stopped to talk to a street musician for 20 minutes and tipped him generously, and Rose took photographs of everything as if the world were made of things worth preserving, which was simply how Rose moved through the world. Richard was pleasant throughout. He was always pleasant when the effort required was temporary and bounded. He knew the trip had a defined end, and he could manage anything with a defined end. The trouble began at breakfast on the morning of the taping, when Dion arrived at the hotel restaurant 12 minutes late, and Richard made a comment, not loudly, not to Dion directly, but to Angela in the tone of a man registering an observation, about how some people had no respect for other people's time. Angela had said nothing. She had looked at her husband for a moment with an expression that said everything her words did not, and then she had smiled at her brother when he sat down and poured him coffee. Rose, seated directly across from Richard at the breakfast table, had heard every word. She had spent 71 years learning to absorb things that were not intended for her to absorb. She straightened slightly and looked at her orange juice and said nothing. Harold, beside her, reached under the table and took his wife's hand. Dion sat down and ate his eggs and did not know what had happened, and Angela was grateful for that small mercy. They took a car to the studio. The morning air was warm and the city was bright, and Angela sat in the back seat between her mother and her brother and thought about the word hope and how long she had been carrying it and how tired her arms were getting. The Family Feud studio had the quality all well-run television sets have, a specific warmth generated by lights and energy, and the practiced enthusiasm of a production team whose job it is to make people feel like today is the best possible day to be alive. The Calloway family was absorbed into that warmth easily. Rose was visibly delighted by everything, the set, the lights, the scale of the audience. Harold stood with his hands in his pockets and smiled the smile of a man who has spent his life being genuinely interested in new things. Dion looked around with the understated appreciation of a man who has decided to enjoy himself and is making good on that decision. Angela was present and warm, the way she was always warm in social situations, with a small additional layer of alertness she carried whenever Richard was in proximity to her family. Richard was in excellent form. He was good at openings. He shook hands efficiently, made the right comments, established himself in the room with the confident ease of a man who moves through professional spaces well. Steve Harvey came out and the studio went up, and Richard was laughing and engaged and looked, for all the world, like exactly the kind of fun, relaxed family man that a game show audience loves. Steve worked his way down the Calloway line. He spent a warm minute with Rose, who told him she had watched the show every evening for 6 years, and that he had gotten more handsome with time, which delighted the audience and made Steve laugh his real laugh. He told Harold he had the look of a man with excellent stories, and Harold said he had a few, and Steve said he was going to hold him to that. With Dion, Steve was easy and quick. They had the natural back and forth of two people who share a frequency, and the audience liked them together immediately. Then Steve reached Richard and Angela. He introduced himself to Richard, who was warm and polished. He turned to Angela and held her hand for a moment and looked at her with the specific attentiveness he brings to people he has been watching since they walked in. "How are you doing?" he asked her. "I am very happy to be here," Angela said. It was a true statement. It was also not a complete answer to the question he had asked. Steve held her hand a beat longer than standard courtesy required. Then he smiled and moved on. He had been doing this for a long time. He knew the difference between someone who was happy and someone who was holding something alongside their happiness. In the brief period between the family introductions and the start of the first round, While the production team made final technical adjustments and Steve worked the audience, the Calloway family stood together at their side of the stage. Rose was looking out at the audience with quiet pleasure. Harold was saying something to Dion that was making Dion try not to laugh. Richard leaned toward Angela and said something. It was not directed at a microphone. He was not performing for the room. He said it the way he said things at home, as if the space around him were private property. The boom microphone above them caught it clearly. He said, "Try to keep your mother from talking too much during the rounds. She held us up at breakfast, and we do not need her slowing things down here too." Angela went still. The specific stillness of a person who has heard a version of this sentence so many times that the body has developed its own response. A pause, a containment, the brief and practiced process of deciding not to react. But 3 feet away, Steve Harvey had heard it through his earpiece from the sound team. He did not react immediately. He finished what he was saying to the audience. He smiled. He prepared for the game. He filed what he had heard in the place where he files things that he is going to come back to. Rose had not heard the comment. Harold had not heard it. Dion was still trying not to laugh at whatever his father had said. The production team heard it. Several audience members seated close to the stage heard it and exchanged glances. Angela smoothed the front of her jacket and turned to face the stage with the expression she had spent 13 years perfecting. The expression of a woman who loves her husband and loves her family, and has become very good at standing in the space between those two things without letting either of them see the cost. The Calloway family was matched against the Washington family from Houston, a 5-person team whose eldest member, a 66-year-old retired schoolteacher named Gloria, had the buzzer instincts of someone who had spent 38 years asking questions and expecting fast answers. The game was competitive from the opening round. Richard played well, he was fast and accurate, and his competitive streak, which expressed itself in his professional life as the drive of a man who builds successful businesses, translated cleanly onto a game show stage. Angela was sharp and composed. Dion buzzed in at exactly the right moments with answers that were either precisely correct or entertainingly incorrect, both of which the audience appreciated equally. But it was Rose and Harold who made the Calloway family's main game run. Rose hit the top answer on a question about things found in a grandmother's kitchen. She said, "Cast iron skillet," before the question was fully finished, with the authority of a woman for whom this was not a survey category but a personal inventory. The audience loved her. Harold, given a question about things a man is proud of in retirement, said, "My wife," without pausing, and the studio responded with the warmth that specific kind of answer always generates, the warm, involuntary sound of people recognizing something true. The Calloways won the main game by 33 points. The celebration was genuine, 5 people sharing a real moment of collective success. Dion lifting both arms, Rose clapping with the specific delight of a woman having the time of her life. Angela hugged her mother and her father and her brother, and then hugged Richard. And the hug was real because Angela Calloway was a woman who did not perform feelings she did not have. Steve Harvey watched all of it. He watched the way Richard accepted the team's congratulations. He watched the way Richard's hand landed on Harold's shoulder during the celebration, the way it landed rather than rested, the fraction of a second shorter than genuine warmth would have held it. He watched the way Rose laughed and how Richard was positioned just slightly outside the radius of that laugh. Nobody else would have noticed. Steve Harvey noticed. Steve brought the family to center stage for the fast money discussion. 2 players, 5 questions each, 200 points to win $20,000. The family considered their options briefly and agreed that Richard would go first and Angela would close, Richard for his speed and Angela for her steadiness. As Richard moved toward the podium and the rest of the family prepared to go backstage, Richard turned to the group and said, again, not quietly enough, again into the ambient range of a live production's sound capture, "Harold, let the young ones handle it from here. You did your part." Harold smiled. It was a gracious smile, the kind that takes years to develop, the smile of a man who has had a long life and knows which things are worth responding to and which things are better received with dignity and released. He put his arm around Rose and walked with her toward the backstage area. But Rose's smile, a half step behind Harold's, was a different quality. It was the smile of a woman holding something she had been holding for 13 years, and the holding was getting heavier. Dion, who had heard the comment, looked at Richard for one long moment before following his parents backstage. The look was brief and completely legible to anyone paying attention. Then he went. Angela was standing 6 feet away. She had heard it. She turned to face the podium and her expression had changed. not dramatically, not in the way that would be visible from the audience, but in the specific way that the expression of a person who loves someone changes when that person has just done something for which love is not quite enough of an explanation. Steve Harvey had heard all of it. He positioned himself for the round. He looked at Richard, and then he made a decision. Richard stepped to the fast money podium with the confidence of a man who is good at performing under pressure and knows it. Steve asked him the standard preparatory question. Was he ready? Did he understand the format? And Richard gave the standard prepared answer with the additional polish of someone who had been rehearsing it in the car. The first two questions went cleanly. Richard scored 22 points on a question about things people do when they are bored and 37 points on a question about things you find in a man's wallet. He was fast and accurate, and the audience was with him. Then Steve asked the third question. Name something a good son-in-law does for his wife's family. Richard answered, provides for them financially. The board turned. It was the number 4 answer, 9 points. It was technically correct. The survey had agreed it was a thing a good son-in-law did. But it was the lowest scoring answer on the board, and it was, in the specific architecture of this particular afternoon, the answer of a man who had reduced an entire category of relationship to its most transactional expression. Steve Harvey looked at the board. He looked at Richard. He set his index card down on the podium. Richard, he said. His voice was level and warm and had an edge underneath the warmth that was unmistakable to everyone in the room. Can I ask you something? And I want you to know this is a genuine question, not a trick. Richard smiled. Go ahead. That man backstage, Harold, he drove a city bus for 31 years to take care of his family. He raised Angela. He is the reason the woman you married is the woman she is. Steve paused. What do you actually think of him? The studio went quiet. Richard's smile held. Harold is a good man, he said. I believe you believe that, Steve said. And the way he said it, not accusatory, not angry, but precise in the way a good doctor is precise when naming a diagnosis, communicated clearly that believing something and living like you believe it are not the same thing. But I have been on this stage with your family for about an hour, and I have watched some things. And I want to say something to you man to man, because I think you are a smart enough person to hear it. Steve turned slightly to address the room, both the live audience and the cameras, with the directness he reserves for things he is not performing but simply saying. There is a specific kind of man, he said, who builds a good life and then decides, somewhere along the way, that the people who do not match his definition of success are a little less important than the people who do. He does not say this out loud. He is too smart for that, but he says it in small ways every day to the people around him, and the people who feel it most, the ones who absorb it without being able to fully name it, are almost always the people who love him. He paused. I know that man, Steve said. I have been that man, not proud of it, but I know him, and I know what it costs the women who stay married to him. And I know what it costs the families who keep showing up to his table, even when he makes them feel like guests in a home their daughter built. He looked at Richard with the specific directness of someone who is not trying to embarrass, but is absolutely not going to look away. Harold drove a bus for 31 years. Rose altered wedding dresses for 40 years. They raised a woman with enough grace and enough patience and enough love to still be standing beside you after 13 years of being asked, in ways she has to translate for you every single time to choose between you and them. She should not have to make that choice. That choice should not exist. The fact that it exists is not her failure. It is yours. The silence that followed was complete. Then the applause began, the slow-building kind, from the back rolling forward until the room was on its feet. Richard stood at the podium. He was not smiling. He was doing something that was, by the account of several people in the front rows, more difficult to watch and more important. He was listening. Really listening. With the expression of a man who has heard a version of this before and deflected it successfully, and is for the first time encountering it in a form he cannot deflect. Steve made a decision that was not in the production script. He asked the floor manager to bring the whole family back out. All of them, Rose and Harold and Dion and Angela. They came out from backstage into a studio that was still on its feet. Rose looked confused for a moment, and then she saw the room standing and she understood that something had happened while she was backstage, and her eyes filled before she knew why. Steve walked to her directly. He took both of her hands and held them. Mrs. Rose, he said, I want to tell you something in front of everyone in this room and everyone watching at home. You and your husband raised one of the finest women I have met on this stage in 10 years of doing this show. The way she carries herself, the way she plays for her family, the way she loves people even when it costs her, that came from you. And you deserve to be told that, out loud, in public. Rose Calloway, who had been absorbing small diminishments for 13 years with the gracious quiet of a woman who had decided that her daughter's marriage was more important than her own feelings about it, stood in the center of a television studio and cried. Not dramatically, not with any performance in it. She simply stood there with her hands in Steve Harvey's hands and her face wet and her dignity completely intact. Harold put his arm around her from behind and she leaned into him and the room stayed standing. Angela was crying. Dion was crying, which surprised him, and he looked briefly annoyed at himself about it, which made the audience laugh through their own emotion. Richard stood apart for a moment. He was looking at his wife's parents, really looking at them, in the specific way that a person looks at something they have been failing to see. Then he walked to Harold and extended his hand, and Harold took it, and the handshake lasted longer than handshakes usually do, and when it ended, Harold clapped him once on the arm and said something quietly that only Richard heard. Richard nodded. His jaw was set. His eyes were bright. He was holding something together, and the effort of it was visible, and visible effort is always more honest than performed ease. Steve brought the game back. Richard had scored 68 points in his round before the interruption, a strong foundation. Angela needed 132 from her 5 questions to win the $20,000. She stepped to the podium and Steve looked at her for a moment before speaking. "How are you?" he asked. "Better," she said, and she meant it in more ways than one. She answered all 5 questions with the calm, applied precision that had characterized everything she had done that day. She scored 47 points on a question about things you do before a family dinner, 38 on a question about words that describe a good mother, 29 on a question about what a wife wants most from her husband, 21 on a question about things found in a family photo album, and closed with 14 points on a question about things that get better with time. 149 points. Combined with Richard's 68, the Calloway family finished with 217, 17 points over the threshold. They had won the $20,000. The board lit up, and the studio responded with the particular warmth that accumulates in a room that has been through something real together. Not just the clean pleasure of a win, but something fuller and more complicated. The satisfaction of a room that has watched a truth be said, and a family absorb it and come out the other side still standing. Rose clasped her hands and looked upward briefly, in the way people who have been praying their whole lives instinctively look up when something good arrives. Harold laughed, a full, warm, real laugh. Dion grabbed his sister and held on. Richard put his arms around Angela and held her in the way he held her when things were genuinely good between them, which they had been at various points in 13 years, and which Angela still believed they could be again, which was why she was still there. After the taping, in the private room the production team made available to the family, Harold and Richard sat together for about 20 minutes while the others talked and cried and came down from the afternoon. What they said has not been shared publicly. What Angela has said about it is this: "My father came out of that conversation the same man he went in as, which is who he always is. Richard came out of it different. I do not know everything that was said. I know that my father is a man who does not speak to wound and does not withhold what needs to be said. And I know my husband sat with him for 20 minutes and listened. That is more than I have ever seen Richard give anyone that much quiet attention." Dion, who spent the same 20 minutes sitting with his mother, has said simply, "Dad took care of it. That's what Dad does." The episode aired on a Tuesday evening 5 weeks after the taping. The clip of Steve Harvey's speech, specifically the passage beginning, "There is a specific kind of man who builds a good life and then decides, somewhere along the way, that the people who do not match his definition of success are a little less important," circulated within the first hour of broadcast and had been shared 30 million times before midnight. The response was one of the most sustained the show had ever generated. It ran for weeks rather than days because the clip kept being rediscovered by new audiences, kept being shared in new contexts, kept finding people who recognized in it something they had been trying to articulate about their own lives. Marriage counselors shared it in waiting rooms. Adult children of difficult in-law situations shared it with their partners. Women who had spent years navigating the specific tension of a husband who tolerated rather than embraced their families shared it without comment, which communicated everything necessary. Steve Harvey's specific framing, "The people who absorb it without being able to fully name it are almost always the people who love him," became one of the most discussed sentences from any episode that season. It appeared in relationship advice columns. It was quoted at a conference on family therapy in a presentation on the long-term effects of in-law conflict on marital satisfaction. It was shared by a pastor in Birmingham who said it was the most precise secular description of a spiritual problem he had ever heard. The moment when Steve held Rose's hands and told her what she had raised received a different kind of response, quieter, more personal, from people writing about their own mothers and grandmothers. The image of Rose standing with her face wet and her dignity entirely intact became, for many viewers, the image that stayed. Not the confrontation, not the win. The face of a woman in her 70s receiving, finally and publicly, the acknowledgement she had earned. Richard Calloway has not spoken publicly about the episode. He agreed, with Angela's encouragement, to speak briefly to a journalist for a follow-up piece the show commissioned 8 months later. He said 3 things of note. The first was that watching the footage back had been among the most uncomfortable experiences of his adult life, not because of what Steve Harvey had said, but because of what he could see on his own face and in his own posture in the footage. "I could see it," he said. "I could see what I was doing from the outside, and I did not like it." The second was that he had started attending a men's group at his church, not as a grand gesture, but as a practical decision made by a man who recognized that 13 years of a particular pattern was not going to be reversed without deliberate work. "I am stubborn," he said. "That has served me well in business. It has not served me well at home. I am working on understanding the difference." The third thing he said was the simplest. When asked what had changed most in the months since the episode, he said, "I call Harold on Sundays. He tells me stories. They are good stories. I should have been listening to them a long time ago." Angela has described the months after the episode with the careful honesty of a woman who loves her husband and is not interested in either idealizing or condemning the process of a real marriage finding its way back to something functional. She has said that the change was not dramatic or sudden. That would have been suspicious, she has noted, because dramatic sudden changes rarely hold. What happened instead was incremental, a recalibration, a series of small choices made differently than they had been made before. Richard began arriving at Rose and Harold's house for Sunday dinners without being asked. Not every Sunday, but enough Sundays that it stopped being notable and started being expected, which is what consistency always eventually becomes. He ate Harold's cooking and said so. He asked Rose about her sewing work, and on 2 occasions brought her bolts of fabric he had come across at an estate sale that he thought she might be able to use, which she later described to Dion as the most unexpectedly touching thing her son-in-law had ever done. He and Dion have a relationship now that could not have been predicted from the man who muttered about Dion's 12-minute tardiness at a hotel breakfast. They are not close in the way that men who genuinely like each other are close, but they are respectful. They talk about basketball. Dion has helped Richard with a plumbing issue in the house twice, and Richard has paid him properly both times without the comment about family discount that Dion had fully expected. Angela has said that the most important change is one that is the hardest to describe. It is a change in how it feels to be in the same room with her husband and her parents at the same time. The room used to have a particular atmospheric quality, a slight tension, a constant low-level management effort on her part, the invisible labor of a woman monitoring 2 frequencies simultaneously and adjusting herself accordingly. That quality has reduced, not disappeared, reduced. And the reduction, accumulated over months, has given her back something she had not realized she had spent. At a media event 14 months after the episode aired, Steve Harvey was asked about the moments on Family Feud that had shaped him most as a host. He named 3. The Calloway episode was one of them. "What I said to Richard Calloway that day," he said. "I said because it needed to be said, and I was the person in the room who could say it without it costing anyone their marriage. That is a privilege that comes with the position I am in. When I am on that stage, I can see things that the family is too close to see clearly. I can name things that the people living inside them cannot name without it becoming a fight. And I have come to believe, over many years of doing this, that using that position to tell the truth when the truth is needed is not just something I am permitted to do. It is something I am responsible for." He paused for a moment. "What I want people to take from that afternoon is not the confrontation. I want them to take Rose's face. That woman stood in that room with 60 years of quiet dignity, and she received, maybe for the first time publicly, the acknowledgement of what she had done and who she had raised. And she did not collapse into it. She stood there and received it with her whole self, and she was beautiful. That is what I want people to remember, not what a man did wrong, what a woman had earned. And what it looks like when someone finally says so out loud." The $20,000 from Family Feud went several directions that matter. A portion paid for Rose and Harold's 40th anniversary trip, a cruise they had talked about for years and never taken. They went in the spring. Rose sent Angela photographs from every port, each one captioned with something her husband had said or done. Harold danced on the deck on the second evening, and Rose photographed that too. A portion went toward Dion's oldest child's first year of college costs, a contribution Richard made without being asked, and without announcement, which Angela discovered when her brother called to thank her, and she genuinely did not know what he was talking about. She found Richard in his office and asked him. He said it was the right thing to do. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and then she walked in and held him, and he held her back, and neither of them said anything more about it. Harold is 75 now and still in good health. He still tells stories. He has started telling them to Richard on Sunday phone calls, which are 30 minutes on average, and Richard has started telling Angela the stories afterward over dinner, which is how Angela knows he is actually listening. Rose still alters wedding dresses. She has turned down retirement 3 times because the work connects her to something she is not ready to let go of. The women who come into her shop nervous and leave with something fitted exactly right, feeling exactly as they should feel on one of the important days of their lives. She says the work is prayer, said with her hands. Angela still anchors the household and the family and the Sunday dinners, but the anchoring is lighter now. The labor is more evenly distributed. She has started taking a ceramics class on Thursday evenings, something just for herself, with no practical purpose, which is the specific kind of freedom that becomes available to a woman when the people around her finally start carrying their share of the weight. She told Rose about the ceramics class on a Tuesday afternoon while they were sitting in Rose's kitchen drinking tea. Rose looked at her daughter for a long moment and then reached across the table and covered her hand with her own and said, "Good." "It's your turn," Angela laughed. Rose laughed. The kitchen was warm and the tea was good, and outside the window the neighborhood was going about its ordinary life, which is all that any of them had ever wanted, the ordinary, unguarded life of a family that does not have to brace itself anymore. That is what Steve Harvey stepped in for on a Thursday afternoon on a game show stage. Not drama, not a lesson. Just this, the possibility that a family might one day sit in a kitchen and laugh together without anyone bracing. It was worth stepping in for. It always is. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the family around someone you love and whether they feel truly welcomed, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. These are the stories that matter most. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one.